Hello, Silo Health Trainees. My name is Jahan Khamsazadeh, and here in Module 2, you're just coming from the roles of psilocybin peer support with Scott Jensen, and I'll be talking about the history of trip sitting. A little about me: I got my doctorate in the Philosophy, Cosmology, Consciousness program at CIS. My dissertation was on psilocybin mushrooms. It's just come out. It's as a book. You can find it everywhere. It's called The Psilocybin Connection, Psychedelics, the Transformation of Consciousness and Evolution on the Planet, an Integral Approach. It'll cover a lot of what I'll be speaking here today. Aside from academic background, I trained for years in the Mazatec mushroom tradition, and I lead legal psilocybin ceremonies in Jamaica with Atman retreats and advise several different psychedelic organizations. So we're going to get into a topic that I find deeply interesting, and hopefully will bring a lot of meaning to your progress here as you learn to hold space with different states of consciousness. And this is one of the oldest occupations and roles within humanity. As anthropologists note, shamanism was probably the first kind of social role that evolved within humanity. And so why are we doing this deep history? One is to bring a lot of more meaning and context to these practices. We're stepping into a lineage in many ways that has been a part of humanity since its origins. So psychedelics naturally grow in almost every ecosystem. There's over 200 different species of psilocybin mushrooms found around the world, found on every continent but Antarctica. They're most plentiful where our ancestors first evolved in the African savannas. As Paul Stamets, the mycologist, notes, the most common mushroom there is as of psilocybin variety. So these have been in our ecosystems and around us since our emergence, and human beings first began to use these probably millions of years ago, as Terence McKenna points out, is probably the original catalysts for human intelligence. But we know for sure there's cave paintings going back about 9,000 BCE, in the caves of Africa, and cave paintings depicting mushroom roots have been found around the world, going back thousands of years, all across Europe and Central and South America. And so we're becoming a part of a process here that has deep, rich history. And so we're going to be exploring some of the more particular parts of that history. And so, when you come and hold space for each other, take this super seriously. It's a very serious process that I think requires a deep sense of responsibility. These states catalyzed with Stanislav Grof, the great transpersonal psychologist who had been doing psychedelic psychotherapy kind of work for about 60 years. They catalyzed what's known as holotropic states of consciousness that organically move towards wholeness. So your role as a sitter is largely to bring a greater sense of safety to the situation, and let the processes organically begin to emerge as our psyche begins to heal itself. So the sense of safety, and therefore a deep sense of trust of who you are as a human being and honoring of boundaries, is critical in this process of holding space for one another. But so really grounded in that we're holding space for natural processes that is a deep part of nature. As I mentioned, these plants and fungi grow everywhere, but when we get to know them a little bit more intimately, it can bring a lot more meaning of just how and why they work. So we'll focus on psilocybin mushrooms from right now. Mushrooms themselves are the fruits of a larger body of the fungus. The larger body is known as mycelium. It's a large underground network that interconnects all the roots within an ecosystem. 90% of plants have a symbiotic relationship to just mushrooms in general. To fungi, 80% of those plants would stop existing if fungi were eliminated. So they pretty much hold the biosphere of the planet together. And so our species evolved on top of this living network that's been underground our feet our entire time. As pointed out in the book Entangled Life, How Fungi Make Our Worlds, Change Our Minds, and Shape Our Futures, by mycologist Merlin Sheldrake, he points out that it's theorized psilocybin is at least 66 million years old, so far predates humanity. And there's been good work done about nature and psychedelics in general. A noticeable book is by Giorgio Saramani in his book Animals and Psychedelics, showcasing how many animals across the kingdom use psychedelic substances. And another notable book is Intoxication by Ronald K. Siegel. He's a UCLA psychopharmacologist. Did a large survey of intoxication throughout the animal kingdom, and came to the conclusion about 93% of animals actually alter their consciousness chemically. It's so much that he calls it the fourth drive of evolution. So after the drive for sex, food, and to thirst, given the opportunity, animals will alter their consciousness if it's available. So we're here engaging in processes that are widespread in nature, that have been far beyond the human species, that we're participating in. And we know now that psilocybin engages the 5-HT2A serotonin receptors, creates a hyper state of connectivity in the brain, creates neuroplasticity, re-enlivens the atrophy of many dendrites. So these are deep biological and natural processes that we're participating in, to have a deep sense of intelligence. So much of our work is actually honoring that process. And the history of how we probably began holding space for these, again, it's a deep, long history. We probably first started using psychedelics once we just came across them, as our primate ancestors were roaming the African savannas. They came across mushrooms and parties, just eat them as they found it. And this would have been more like microdose amounts, mushroom at a time. But not too long after, and not too long being very relative, whether it's thousands of years or so, or millions, we eventually evolved rituals. We came to the intelligence that we could plan and would gather a whole bunch of mushrooms and create ritual containers. A lot of these ritual containers eventually started taking place in caves. As David Lewis Williams, the cognitive archaeologist that did decades of work observing cave art through Africa and Europe, concluded that likely the emergence of art, specifically cave art, but that's the prototype of the rest of the art that followed, was likely first catalyzed by psychedelic states of consciousness. And the cave would have provided many things for the explorer, including a safe container. One, it could be dark during the daytime, so people can really go internal and then be facilitated by a shaman, the medicine man or woman. But also there's just one entrance, and it could be guarded, so predators could not get in, and people were likely just sit in their own place. They wouldn't have to worry about fluctuations in the weather and so on. So it created very much a safe container. So likely a lot of our first peer-supported experiences were likely in caves once we started moving to the ritual level. And this likely continued for quite some time and fits well with what Yuval Noah Harari points out in his book, Sapiens, was known as the cognitive revolution, the creation then of myths and art and language, where our species evolution no longer just determined by our biology, but by our cognition and the culture that we had created. And to really kind of keep anchoring in how this is a deep part of the process of nature, there's a great book by Richard Doyle called Darwin's Pharmacy, Sex, Plants, and Evolution of the Noosphere. And for his research, the professor had read thousands of trip reports and deduced that the most common psychedelic insight is that the participant realizes they're part of a vast, interconnected living system, and they should be retermed ecodelics, that they bring a sense of ecological awareness. So now, why would plants or fungi in the environment predominantly focus on creating ecological awareness? Well, it has a lot of incentives. As, for example, we'll just take a course of mycelium. If the host environment is healthy, and it's helping evolve and bring an awareness to the organisms within that environment, the mycelium can theoretically live forever. So there's a lot of incentives to keep everybody really healthy in the environment and to bring awareness so it doesn't move to a sense of self-destruction. In many ways, it can be argued that our species is out of balance right now, internally within ourselves, but large parts with our ecosystem, because we haven't made use of these ecodelics, or as I like to call them, Gaian molecules, Gaian being the large context of a living planet. It's a perspective integrating an animist worldview, which is a worldview put forward by almost all the indigenous traditions, going back to the shamanic roots at the core of all of our histories, that this world is pretty much alive. And this is not losing reason, it's just transrational, meaning that there's a deep interconnectedness and sense of consciousness that connects all of us. And a great survey about how shamanism has been seen throughout history has been put forward by Jeremy Narabi in his book, Shaman Through Time, 500 Years on the Path to Knowledge. And so when the conquistadors and the Europeans first came across the shamans and medicine men or women, for the first about 100 years, they saw them as devil worshippers. And within this, right, and sell them as heretics, they reasoned that it was okay to kill them. And so when the Europeans came to the Americas, it was the greatest ethnocide in human history, and a third of the population of North, Central, South America was lost. And these are largely rich psychedelic cultures. As the clergy had pointed out, psychedelic use was rampant within the Mayans, the Toltecs, and the Aztecs. A few hundred years later, they stopped seeing them necessarily as devil worshippers, but then as charlatans. So people that were doing gimmicks to manipulate, to perhaps take money or goods from other people. Then moving into the 1900s, anthropologists began seeing the shamans as proto-psychiatrists. So they were playing the roles what the therapists were doing within our society. So take note, we only came to that because we finally in the 1900s had the emergence of our own therapists in the beginning of the field of psychology. So now we had a new kind of metaphorical lens which to view other societies, and saw that these people were doing much of the same role, listening to other people, helping them interpret their experiences and moving deeper into the unconscious. And then coming in down to the finally the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s within our Western culture, as people begin to having these psychedelic experiences within tribal settings, they begin to see the shamans as wisdom holders, holders of the cosmology and the lineage of their tribes. So there's been, quite a movement of really looking down at people holding these kind of spaces, generally from a sense of superiority and as colonizers of who we know better, to actually meeting them on their own terms and going through their practices and then actually coming to have reverence for them. And to note out, it's important to note that here in this training, we are not creating shamans. We're not creating medicine guides, and we're not creating psychedelic psychotherapists. Those each take years, and so I would say even a lifetime of training and work and dedication. We're here to create sitters. It's a harm reduction model coming from the belief that people are going to take psychedelics. That's just what will be happening. And so we're trying to create as much safety as possible. And we know that trained individuals will not be accessible for perhaps the majority of the population. A good portion of the population, especially groups of minorities, are living close to the poverty line. And trained facilitators cost quite a bit. I hold legal psilocybin sessions in Jamaica with Ottoman retreats, and it's quite a privilege for people to be to fly out to Jamaica and participate in these retreats. So what we need to do is to help give each other within all the communities essential fundamental skills to hold space for one another, so they can have this deep healing that I consider a deep birthright of our species, to have safe psychedelic experiences. So there's been a lot of roles throughout time, as I mentioned, moving past the archaic time of humanity. But once we moved into deeper civilizations, they were at the beginning of all these cultures. The Rig Vedas, the oldest historical text of the Hindu tradition, have about 120 lines praising soma, a psychedelic plant or fungi that connects one with God. So now we're seeing these come into more modern religious contexts. And then the most notable culture within the West has been the Greeks. They had the Eleusinian mysteries that went well over 1,000 years long, starting perhaps back at 1500 BCE. And it was done in the town of Eleusis, and these mysteries would be about 10 days long, happen once a year. And it's encouraged that every Greek citizen should come once in their lifetime. And here we had notable names such as Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, Pythagoras, all coming and participating in these rites, where they would drink this brew called kykeon, a psychedelic brew. Brian Borowski released a great book in 2020 called The Immortal Key, The Religion with No Name, really breaking down after 12 years of research that it was likely ergot that they used in this brew from which we derive LSD. His work was based on a lot of other academics. So it's been a deep part of the culture, this kind of space holding and creating containers for deep psychedelic experiences that really have the possibility to transform one's life. We've seen the studies when it comes to just mystical experiences that have taken place in Johns Hopkins and New York School of Medicine for the last 20 years. About 65% of people have a genuine mystical experience with just one session, given the right set and setting. Right set and setting meaning a safe container where they feel they can really let go and surrender, and an adequate dose. So as we keep moving further in culture, as I'd mentioned, as religion took place and a more patriarchal kind of society came, there's like a repression of these practices. People then be seen as witches and just condemned to death simply for having access and using these practices of connecting one to the divine or deeper sense of say supernatural phenomena, meaning super, but that very natural, using plants and fungi. And that takes us pretty much to our culture today with this huge revival, this renaissance, literally translating to rebirth. And as we know now that there's these can promise unprecedented growth and healing for our society. And I'm imagining the rest of the modules are going to go very deep into a lot of the clinical trials and the results that they have had. But there's some books I would love to also recommend for the participants here that can deepen their education. Some books that come to name are the Psychedelic Explorer's Guide by James Fadiman, and definitely one of the best books on the topic. There's checklists there that can go in depth about how to hold these spaces for oneself, from others. There's Allies for Awakening by Ralph Metzner. The Secret Chief Revealed. Leo, who's the focus of the book, was the first psychedelic psychotherapist in the underground world, and he put forward many things that are kind of important to build trust between the participant and the guide. Notably, 3 rules is telling the participant that they cannot hurt themselves, you, or the environment, to please don't leave the space, and that there will be no sexual touch between the participant and the sitter. Way of the Psychonauts recently came out by Stanislav Grof, and that's really the accumulation of about 60 years of work in just 2 volumes. And then a notable book is by Francois Borzat, Consciousness Medicine. She had been working and training guides for about 30 years, taking them down to work with the Mazatecs. And in her book, Consciousness Medicine, she writes, a guide is someone who walks ahead and knows the territory, aware of the potential perils of the terrain. Like the jungle, our inner self is an environment full of beautiful complexity. And many cultures, rituals that invoke expanded states of consciousness and transformation and healing are guided. An appropriate guide is trained in specific techniques that aid the experience of inner exploration. So, why is it so important for, other than obvious reasons on the personal level, why to create these containers? Well, we can simply look back in the 60s and see now clearly why we lost the entrance and integration of psychedelics into culture. There's 2 notable. The first one was that the Nixon administration had deemed psychedelics illegal because it gave them reasons to prosecute people that were activists against the war and minorities. They couldn't legally come and to the protesters and the minorities and get them in trouble for stopping their social rights movements. But what they could do is they could make the substances they were using that are catalyzing these big inner awakenings and having them, feel inspired to lead these movements, that can make those substances illegal and then come after them. But why then did the public actually get on board with this? Well, I think Michael Pollan is very great in his analysis that he puts forward in his book, How to Change Your Mind, that had a huge impact in the field. It came out in 2018, became a bestseller. And he says, what other point in human history did the youth have such a searing rites of passage that the prior generation did not understand? So people in the 60s were having these huge psychedelic awakenings, expanding their sense of self, their identity, and deconditioning from cultural values. And very understandably, this caused tremendous fear in the prior generation, the parents and the people still in power. And a normal response to not understanding and not knowing is anxiety. And there came a desire for safety, especially for the youth. And there's a sweeping movement of making all the substances illegal. But as Michael Pollan notes, by 1965, there were already 1,500 scientific papers written about the therapeutic use of psychedelics, showing how promising, effective they were, that they were not addictive. And they were scheduled as Schedule I substances, saying that they have no potential medical benefits and they're highly addictive. So we lost tremendous ground, largely because we didn't have safe containers to do these things, meaning a safe container, meaning they weren't passed down a lineage, as was likely, and they have been done through entheogenic tribes that have been existing, say, for 1,000 years using these. This is passed down from the elders to the younger generation in an unbroken line. They're also able to create context. They share a sense of cosmology, so they can make meanings of these experiences. But more than that, there was a container, like an actual physical and psychological and emotional space to take these. And because we lacked, these kind of shamanic traditions, the younger generation just took them without containers, and there's major downfalls. There could be major harm to self and others, psychological and emotional trauma, that happens. And so we need now to really create this kind of safe movement to be very responsible and mature individuals and take very seriously the space holding for ourselves and each other. And there's been a lot of movements, including, the Zendo project put on by MAPS to create psychedelic harm reduction areas in places like festivals where there's recreational use, where people, they're having a difficult experience, they could be taken to the Zendo and somebody will be there up for 24 hours and be with them to make sure they're having a safe and hopefully transformative experience. And so what we're needing, is as part of larger culture, and I think is well noted by Terence McKenna, is to find the others, to create community and connection around these experiences and space holding so we can have support, supervision, so we're not alone in this process. And here at Silo Health, we're doing our best to create community and offer these accessible education for people that might otherwise not have access, deeply believing that this is a birthright, that these medicines have healed all of us here. We really want to just make this available, at least the education and the information available for those that want them. All right, thank you for spending time with me here. And next you have up is Module 3, which will be the Pharmacology and Neuroscience with Manesh Karan. Thank you very much, and I wish you very well in the rest of your training.